January 17, 1946. The desert wind moved across the flats like a breath held too long, stirring dust devils between rows of silver fuselages that stretched toward the horizon. In the cold morning light, 10,000 aircraft sat wing to wing in perfect geometric lines. P-51 Mustangs, P-38 Lightnings, B-24 Liberators. Machines that 6 months earlier had owned the skies over Berlin and Tokyo. Now they baked in silence under the Mojave sun, their propellers still, their guns empty, their pilots gone home to lives they barely remembered. A young salvage worker named Robert Hendricks walked between the roads that morning, his boots crunching on the alkaline soil, and later he would write to his sister in Ohio, "I have seen the graveyard of eagles." The P-51 Mustang, the thoroughbred of American air power, the guardian angel of the bomber streams, the fighter that had turned the tide over Europe, had become, almost overnight, a problem of surplus. In the 18 months between VE Day and the end of 1946, the United States Army Air Forces faced a logistical question unprecedented in military history. What does a nation do with 15,000 single-seat fighters designed for a war that has ended? The Mustang, which had cost the American taxpayer approximately $50,000 per unit to manufacture, which had required 25,000 man-hours to build, which represented the pinnacle of piston-engine aviation technology, now sat in vast fields across the American Southwest, at Kingman, at Walnut Ridge in Arkansas, at Ontario in California. Aircraft graveyards where the pride of American engineering awaited an uncertain fate. The men who had flown these machines knew what they represented.
They had climbed into cramped cockpits at dawn over England and Italy, had felt the Merlin engine's 1,200 horsepower shake through the airframe, had pushed the throttle forward and felt the Mustang leap into hostile skies with a responsiveness that made the aircraft feel less like a machine and more like an extension of will. They had escorted bombers deep into the Reich, had dogfought with Luftwaffe aces over the Baltic, had strafed locomotives and airfields and troop columns until the Wehrmacht's ability to move in daylight evaporated. The P-51 had given American pilots a range of 1,400 miles, a top speed of 440 miles per hour, and a kill ratio against German fighters that approached 4-to-1. It was the weapon that had won air superiority, and air superiority had won the war. But wars end, and when they do, the calculus of value transforms overnight. In June of 1945, the United States military operated more than 70,000 aircraft. By December of 1946, that number had been slashed to fewer than 10,000. The American defense budget, which had consumed 40% of GDP during the peak of the war, collapsed to less than 5% in the peacetime drawdown. Congress demanded demobilization, the public demanded their sons and husbands home, and the vast industrial machine that had produced 50,000 fighters and bombers in 1944 alone simply stopped, leaving warehouses and airfields choking with equipment for which there was suddenly no need and no buyer. The Mustang's fate was decided not by sentiment but by spreadsheets. In the immediate aftermath of victory, military planners conducted a ruthless assessment of which aircraft would serve in the peacetime air forces and which would be declared surplus. The criteria were pragmatic: operational cost, maintenance requirements, strategic role, and crucially, whether the design had a future in the jet age that was already dawning.
The P-51, for all its elegance, was a creature of the propeller era. The Army Air Forces had already seen the future in the captured German Me-262 jets, in the British Meteors, in America's own P-80 Shooting Star. The piston engine, no matter how refined, could not compete with the raw speed and climb rate of jet propulsion. The Mustang was a masterpiece, but it was a masterpiece in a language the military was preparing to abandon. Still, 15,000 fighters do not disappear quietly. The initial plan was storage. Beginning in the summer of 1945, Mustangs were ferried from Europe and the Pacific to massive storage facilities across the American Southwest, where the dry climate would preserve the airframes against corrosion. At these sites, they underwent a process called cocooning. Engines were drained and pickled with preservative oil, cockpits were sealed with protective covers, guns were removed, and the aircraft were arranged in tight rows to maximize ground space. The theory was simple: preserve the fleet in case of future need, whether that need be a resumption of hostilities, a new conflict, or simply the long-term attrition of the active force. The practice was chaotic. Thousands of aircraft arrived faster than they could be properly processed. Maintenance records were incomplete or lost entirely. Parts were cannibalized to keep other aircraft flying. And within months, it became clear that the cost of maintaining these vast graveyards far exceeded any realistic assessment of their future value. So the dismantling began. At Kingman alone, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation's War Assets Administration oversaw the scrapping of more than 5,000 aircraft between 1946 and 1947. The process was industrial, efficient, and heartbreaking to those who understood what was being destroyed. Workers used cutting torches to slice through aluminum fuselages, separating components by material type.
Engines were removed and either sold for parts or melted down. Instruments were salvaged for civilian use: altimeters, airspeed indicators, radios, anything with peacetime application. The aluminum itself, tons upon tons of it, was sold to smelters at 7 cents per pound and reborn as cookware, building materials, and automobile parts. One Air Force officer, surveying the operation at Walnut Ridge, remarked to a journalist, "We are feeding our angels into the furnace." But not all the Mustangs went to the smelter. In the confusion and opportunity of the post-war years, hundreds of P-51s found their way into civilian hands, often for prices that seem absurd in retrospect. War Assets Administration auctions sold flyable Mustangs for as little as $1,500, 3% of their original cost. Businessmen, crop dusters, aviation enthusiasts, and adventurers snapped them up. Some saw profit in the aircraft's long range and high speed, converting them for air racing or fast corporate transport. Others simply wanted to own a piece of history, to keep flying the machine that had written its name in the skies over Europe. And a significant number were purchased by foreign governments, nations rebuilding their own air forces in the uncertain peace, who saw in the surplus Mustang an affordable way to field a credible fighter force. This export market became the second life of the P-51. Between 1945 and 1957, Mustangs were sold or given to more than 25 foreign air forces, many of them allies who had fought beside the United States during the war. The Royal Canadian Air Force took delivery of more than 100 P-51Ds, using them as frontline fighters until 1956. Australia purchased 80 Mustangs and deployed them in occupation duties in Japan, and later in ground attack roles during the early Cold War. China, in the chaotic years of its civil war, operated Mustangs on both sides. The Nationalist Air Force received several hundred from American stocks, while communist forces captured and flew others after battlefield victories. Sweden, Switzerland, Italy, the Philippines, Indonesia, the list of operators grew as the Mustang became the most widely exported American fighter of the immediate post-war period. Some of these export Mustangs saw combat again, flying in wars the American public barely noticed. In 1947 and 1948, Israeli pilots flew contraband P-51s smuggled from the United States and Czechoslovakia during the Arab-Israeli War, using them to achieve air superiority against Egyptian Spitfires and providing crucial close air support during key battles. In 1950, when North Korea invaded the South, the infant Republic of Korea Air Force operated 10 P-51 Mustangs, flying ground attack missions in the war's desperate early weeks until jet fighters could be deployed in sufficient numbers. Even after American forces transitioned to F-86 Sabres for air-to-air combat, Mustangs continued flying close air support missions throughout the Korean War, their long loiter time and heavy ordnance load making them ideal for the grinding infantry battles in Korea's mountains. The Mustang's longest combat career, however, belonged to smaller nations that could not afford jet fighters or did not need their speed for the counterinsurgency wars of decolonization. The Dominican Republic Air Force flew P-51s until 1984, nearly 40 years after VE Day. Haiti operated them into the 1970s.
In Africa and Latin America, Mustangs served as tools of internal security, suppressing rebellions and patrolling borders in conflicts that never made international headlines. These late-service Mustangs were often poorly maintained, flown hard in tropical or desert conditions that corroded their airframes, and eventually abandoned when spare parts became impossible to find.
Photographs from the 1970s show P-51s rusting in overgrown airfields in Central America. Their tail numbers still visible, their canopies shattered, vines growing through their cockpits. Ghost ships in the jungle. Meanwhile, in the United States, a peculiar transformation was occurring. The Mustangs that had been purchased cheaply in the late 1940s by civilian pilots began to find a new purpose: air racing. The national air races, which had been suspended during the war, resumed in 1946, and almost immediately the P-51 became the dominant aircraft in the unlimited class. Pilots modified their Mustangs extensively, removing military equipment to save weight, lowering the canopy to reduce drag, and tuning the Merlin engines to produce far more than their original horsepower. These racing Mustangs, painted in bright colors and stripped to their essence, competed at events like the Thompson Trophy and later at the Reno Air Races, where they reached speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour in the post-war years. The roar of a Merlin engine at racing power became a nostalgic sound, a connection to the war years that grew more poignant as the distance from 1945 lengthened. But this civilian use came at a cost. Racing crashes destroyed dozens of Mustangs in the post-war decades. Others were lost to accidents during barnstorming shows or cross-country flights by pilots whose skills did not match their ambitions. The Mustang, which had been designed for combat and flown by highly trained military pilots, proved unforgiving in civilian hands. Its high wing loading and powerful engine made it fast but demanding, and many warbirds were bent or destroyed by pilots who misjudged a landing or lost control in a turn. By the late 1950s, the population of flyable P-51s was declining rapidly, not from military use, but from attrition in the civilian world. Then something unexpected occurred.
In the late 1950s and early 1960s, as the generation that had fought the war reached middle age, a nostalgia movement began to emerge. Veterans who had flown combat missions began to seek out the aircraft they had once piloted, wanting to reconnect with a formative experience. Aviation museums started to recognize that warbirds were not merely old military equipment, but historical artifacts worthy of preservation. And a small community of restorers and collectors began to realize that the Mustangs rusting in fields and junkyards represented a finite and diminishing resource. The warbird preservation movement was born, driven by men who understood that once these aircraft were gone, a tangible connection to the Second World War would be lost forever. The restoration of a derelict P-51 is not a casual undertaking. It requires years of work, hundreds of thousands of dollars, expertise in vintage aviation systems, and an obsessive attention to authenticity. Restorers hunt for original parts in barns and desert washes, fabricate components that no longer exist, track down maintenance manuals from the 1940s, and painstakingly rebuild engines that have not run in decades. The goal is not merely to make the aircraft fly again, but to return it to the configuration it held during the war, to make it a time machine that can take a passenger back to the experience of a combat pilot in 1944. And slowly, one project at a time, crashed Mustangs were resurrected. Wrecks pulled from mountainsides where they had lain since wartime training accidents were rebuilt into airworthy condition. Fuselages that had been used as roadside diners or backyard sheds were identified, purchased, and returned to the sky. By the 1970s, the value of a restored P-51 had increased exponentially. An aircraft that sold for $1,500 in 1946 might command $100,000 by 1975, and the price continued to climb. This economic reality created a secondary market of salvage and recovery.
Entrepreneurs began to search overseas for Mustangs that had been abandoned by foreign air forces, organizing expeditions to recover aircraft from remote airfields in Central America, the Caribbean, even the jungles of Indonesia. Some of these recovery projects bordered on the absurd, P-51s airlifted by helicopter from jungle clearings, disassembled and shipped back to the United States in containers, their data plates the only original components not too corroded to save. But each recovery added to the surviving population, and each restoration was a small victory against the relentless attrition of time. The most poignant recoveries were those with documented combat histories. A P-51D that had flown with the 357th Fighter Group out of England that bore the scoreboard of aerial victories on its fuselage, that still carried the scratched initials of its crew chief under the cockpit. Such an aircraft was not merely a machine, but a memorial. Restoration teams would research the pilots who had flown it, contact surviving veterans or their families, and sometimes the completed aircraft would be painted to match wartime photographs, right down to the nose art and personal markings. When such a Mustang flew again, it carried with it the ghosts of missions over Munich and Berlin, the memory of men who had not come home, the weight of history made tangible in aluminum and steel. Yet even as the preservation movement succeeded in saving hundreds of Mustangs, it could not save them all. Thousands had already been cut up for scrap. Hundreds more had crashed or been abandoned beyond recovery, and the brutal mathematics of attrition continued. For every Mustang restored to flying condition, another was damaged in a ground accident or lost to a crash. The warbird community learned painful lessons in the 1980s and 1990s, as several high-profile accidents killed experienced pilots and destroyed irreplaceable aircraft.
The Mustang's performance characteristics, the very qualities that made it a superb fighter, made it dangerous to fly casually. It demanded respect, skill, and constant attention. A moment's inattention on landing could ground loop the narrow-geared fighter. A mishandled engine failure could leave no altitude for recovery. The P-51 was not a forgiving aircraft, and the price of that lack of forgiveness was measured in bent metal and lost lives. By the turn of the 21st century, the surviving population of P-51 Mustangs had stabilized at roughly 200 flyable examples worldwide, with perhaps another 300 in museums or private collections in static display condition. This represents approximately 3% of the aircraft built, a survival rate roughly consistent with other major warbird types. But the Mustang's cultural significance had grown far beyond its numbers. It had become the symbol of American air power in World War II, the romantic fighter that represented both technological superiority and the individual pilot's skill. Films and documentaries featured the Mustang prominently. Air shows drew crowds to watch the sleek fighters perform, their Merlin engines a living link to the 1940s. And for veterans, the sight of a P-51 overhead could still bring tears, a reminder of youth and sacrifice, and a war that had defined their generation. In 2024, the oldest surviving P-51 pilots are in their late 90s or have passed on entirely. The generation that flew these aircraft in combat is disappearing, and with them, the first-hand knowledge of what it meant to take a Mustang into battle at 22,000 feet over hostile territory, to fight for your life in a dogfight, to nurse a damaged fighter home across the channel on one engine.
The warbird preservation community has recognized this loss and has worked to record oral histories, to document the experiences of the men who flew combat missions, to capture their voices before silence claims them all. And the Mustangs themselves have become even more precious, not as military hardware, but as flying memorials, as the last physical embodiments of an experience that cannot be repeated or fully conveyed in words. The question of what happened to America's P-51 Mustangs after World War II is ultimately a story about value and memory, about how societies decide what is worth keeping and what can be discarded. In the immediate aftermath of victory, the Mustang's value was measured in strategic utility, and it was found wanting against the rise of jet propulsion. Thousands were destroyed without sentiment, converted into raw materials for a peacetime economy that saw no use for single-seat fighters. But in the decades that followed, a different kind of value emerged: historical, emotional, symbolic. The Mustang came to represent not just a weapon system, but an entire era, a moment when American industrial might and pilot skill combined to achieve air dominance and thereby victory. And so the survivors were cherished, restored, preserved, flown in honor of those who had flown them in anger. There is a particular sound that airshow audiences know well, a sound that separates the Mustang from every other warbird. It is the sound of the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine at full power, a deep, resonant roar that seems to contain within it both music and violence. The Merlin does not scream like a radial engine. It sings, a baritone note that carries for miles and seems to vibrate the air itself. When a restored P-51 makes a low pass at an airshow, that sound washes over the crowd, and for a moment, the distance between past and present collapses. People who were not born until decades after the war can close their eyes and hear what a British villager heard in 1944 when formations of Mustangs passed overhead, outbound for Germany. The sound is a time machine, more effective than any photograph or film, because it engages senses that memory holds most deeply. And perhaps that is the final answer to what happened to the P-51 Mustang after World War II. Some were destroyed, some were sold, some fought in forgotten wars, some crashed in races or accidents, and some were saved by people who understood that certain objects transcend their original purpose to become vessels of memory. The Mustang did not simply become obsolete and disappear. It transformed from weapon to symbol, from tool of war to keeper of history. And in that transformation, it gained a kind of immortality that its designers never intended, but that its pilots would surely recognize. Part of a commemoration marking the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Paris. The pilot, a civilian warbird operator who had spent 3 years restoring the aircraft, dropped down to 500 feet over the reflecting pool, the Lincoln Memorial behind him, the Capitol ahead. Below, a crowd of thousands, veterans in wheelchairs, children holding flags, tourists from a dozen nations, looked up as the silver fighter passed overhead, the Merlin song echoing off the marble monuments. An old man standing near the World War II memorial, his garrison cap marked with the patch of the 8th Air Force, raised his hand in salute and held it as the Mustang climbed away into the blue. His grandson, standing beside him, asked what he was thinking. The old man did not lower his hand until the aircraft was a distant speck. Then he said quietly, "I'm thinking about the boys who didn't make it home. I'm thinking the sound of that engine is the sound of them coming back, just for a moment."
The Mustang circles still over the republic it defended, not in squadrons of hundreds as it once did, but in ones and twos, carefully maintained and reverently flown. It appears at air shows and memorial flights, at commemorations and veteran reunions, and each appearance is both celebration and eulogy. The men who flew it in combat are nearly all gone now. The factories that built it are long closed. The war it was designed to fight has receded into history, its veterans becoming statistics, its urgency incomprehensible to generations raised in the long peace that victory secured. But the Mustang endures, an artifact that refuses to be merely historical, an object that insists on remaining alive and loud and present. In its survival, in the devotion of those who restore and fly it, in the crowds that gather to watch it pass, there persists an understanding that some things must be preserved, not for their utility, but for their meaning, not for what they can do, but for what they represent: courage, sacrifice, the high cost of freedom, and the fleeting beauty of youth in wartime skies.